Now, the state representative Margaret Good has flipped District 72. Could that be a sign of the future? Here to talk about that and whether anything will happen on gun legislation in the wake of the shooting in Parkland is University of Tampa professor and author of the upcoming book, The 2014 Elections in Florida, Professor Mary Anderson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first question for you, we'll start with the Parkland shooting. You heard the Senator Nelson talking about a law in Florida that mandates every gun purchase should require a criminal background check. He says that's not happening. Is that true? And if it's not, why not?
It's true. It is not happening. So federal law requires legally licensed gun sellers to do background checks. But that means that there are unlicensed sellers who maybe they're, gun enthusiasts and they're selling part of their collection at a gun show. They are not required to do that.
And that's what people sometimes refer to as the gun show loophole.
Yes.
But it's not really about gun shows. I think they call it that because people go to gun shows and then they do private sales like out in the parking lot or whatever. So if I'm going to sell you a gun that I'm not using anymore, there's no background check at all. You could be a completely crazy person and it doesn't, I wouldn't know that.
Correct.
Okay. How do you solve that problem?
So it's a difficult one. And there's a lot of policy solutions perhaps out there. Part of the problem is actually, for Washington and Tallahassee, is recognizing that this is the problem, right? So once we recognize that there's a problem, then there's a set of possible solutions that can be implemented and enacted. And there's a lot of folks saying, well, maybe that wouldn't have prevented. I mean, the young man that bought the gun, Nicholas Cruz, he bought it legally. He passed a background check. Would it have prevented him? No, right? But there are other instances where maybe that can prevent a further mass shooting.
And I think what we've seen now with all the signs that were missed by law enforcement that he should not have been able to buy that gun if those signs were acted upon.
Correct.
Okay, so what other legislation can Florida tackle in the wake of all this gridlock in Washington?
Well, I think they need to take it piecemeal, right? There's broad public support for different types of bans on assault rifles, raising the age. So it's 18 to purchase a rifle, 21 to purchase a handgun. There is a 3-day waiting period in the state of Florida. However, when I was looking some of this up this week for this segment, if that does not come back in time, so if the background check, for whatever reason, takes longer than it needs to, past the 3 days, that sale can still go through.
Yeah, we've seen that.
So maybe extending, perhaps that time, or waiting for a decision to come back on the background check. There's a lot of different things that they can do, but they have to have the political will to do it.
And of course, you mentioned the rifles. I mean, I think that probably was intended initially, and I'm not positive on this, but obviously there's a hunting element to owning a rifle, but then you include AR-15s if they're in that category.
Correct.
That gun is certainly not for hunting.
No. No, and the number of the magazine capacity, something else that can be looked at in terms of legislation. Sure. So there's a number of different solutions that have broad public support. It's just a matter of having the political will to actually engage in these discussions. And as Representative Good said, there's a lot of bills that are just not even being talked about.
Let's talk about why that political will is not there. Is it a money issue? I mean, the NRA contributes a lot of money into elections on the national level, relatively speaking. Is it as big a problem in Tallahassee?
Money in politics is pervasive at all levels. So I think there's two things going on here. One is financing of campaigns, right? So folks are continually having to run for re-election, and they have to raise money to do that. Secondly is the enthusiasm. So the enthusiasm gap, you might say. There are lots of folks who vote on single issues. More folks on the right vote on the single issue of Second Amendment rights than folks on the left vote for gun control as a single issue item. So closing that gap, rivaling, thank you, the NRA with a group that can bring that message.
A gun control group like the Newtown group of mothers. And it does seem as though it's not just about money that's contributed from special interest groups. It's also about a very fervent group of voters who really care about that issue.
Exactly.
So I don't want to run out of time with you. I do want to talk about Representative Good's win this week. Is this a sign of things to come? Is she, you know, sort of the front runner in what's going to happen later on in November, or is that not necessarily the case?
So I think special elections are really just that. They're special. They're unique. They're happening at a time period when nothing else per se is happening. There were 2 other elections that happened around the country, also on February 13th. Republicans held on to those 2 seats. Maggie Good was able to flip one. That being said, she's correct, I think, in what she said in terms of generating a lot of enthusiasm for her campaign and for her message. I don't know that that's necessarily going to translate into a Democratic wave. It remains to be seen. What Representative Good had, though, by all accounts from folks that I've spoken with in Sarasota, is an absolutely amazing get out the vote campaign. That grassroots, knocking on doors like she was talking about, making the phone calls, having people on board the campaign, that's the sort of thing that wins elections. That's what we saw in Alabama, right, in that special election as well. It's groups who might sometimes be on the sidelines that are now coming back into the fold.
And I think that's what we saw in Alabama as well. All politics are local, obviously. Yes. And if you, doesn't matter how people feel if they don't go to the voting booth.
Correct.
It doesn't really matter.
Yep.
Professor Mary Anderson, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. Quite an honor. Thank you so much. We will be right back, folks.